The UK economy has undergone a real battering in the past 15 years. For decades, the economy grew by more than 2% a year, but in recent years has barely grown at all. Compared to other countries like France, Germany and Australia, the UK has really fallen behind in terms of household income. It's not just about a global economic downturn. UK productivity has been lower than other countries. And so it becomes easy to paint a picture of doom and gloom, an economy in decline, a country in retreat. However, amidst all the pessimism, there are 7 reasons to be more optimistic about the future. Firstly, if the UK could catch up this lost ground with similar economies, such as Australia, France and Germany, it could in theory mean an extra £8,000 per household, an extra £100 billion in tax revenue. So if the UK regained its past performance, it would be transformative for the economy and everything would look very different. Now, in the past, UK managed productivity growth of 2% in the post-war period. But since 2007, there's been this big loss in potential output. And the problem is that this low growth caused something of a negative spiral. Because of low growth and low demand, investment has been falling too. In fact, the UK has one of the lowest rates of investment in the G7. But the good thing is that with this low level of investment, it means that in theory the UK has a lot of what we call catch-up potential. A good example is that the UK is seeing one of the poorest growths in capital intensity. In fact, a lot of UK growth has been based on people working longer hours. Now, an example is that the UK lags behind in automation. In robot intensity, the UK is well below the global average. It doesn't even make the top 20. However, if this were to change, then there's a lot of potential productivity gains to be made. And 2023 saw big growth in the adoption of robot technology. If we watch news or even YouTube videos, it's easy to be overwhelmed by negative stories. The UK steel industry is closing, the car industry in retreat. We have the most expensive electricity. We could go on and on. But what you might not hear about is that the UK is actually quite good at some things. In 2022, the UK TV and film industry received over $5 billion in inward investment. This industry is projected to grow to $8 billion by 2026. Other strong exports from the UK include video games, education, scientific instruments, and financial services. UK manufacturing has been in decline since the turn of the last century, but the decline in manufacturing is being offset by growth in the service sector. The UK is never going to be able to compete manufacturing with China and India, but exports from the service sector don't have to be inferior to exports from the manufacturing sector. The secret of a modern economy is to specialise what you are good at, not what you think you should do. For example, in 2023, the UK rejected a proposal to build a new film studio in Marlow, Buckinghamshire, because of NIMBY pressure. But the UK gets more export revenue from media exports than it does from steel and coal. The Economist asked a group of economists who specialise in economic growth what one policy would make the biggest difference to increasing growth. The overwhelming response was planning reforms. In the UK, in the past 40 years, we've not been very good at building things, partly because of planning rules. The UK has fallen behind. There's been a decline in built-up areas per capita, which is reflected in higher house prices. So planning reforms could make a big difference to promoting economic growth. Now, it may not be very popular. The people in Marlow didn't want a film studio in their backyard. But if we look at, say, the French economy, now they have innumerable problems. High debt, bloated public sector, excessive regulation, perennial strikes. But despite all these things that are supposed to hobble an economy, it is quite good at building things. And this kind of compensates for all the other problems. So real planning reforms could help the UK economy, although of course it will have side effects. Not always be popular if you build houses in local areas. Now, another reason is that traditionally the UK has seen very low saving ratios. We tend to borrow more, run down savings and spend. But since the pandemic, this habit has really changed quite dramatically, with consumers saving much more. Now, this may partly reflect an ageing population, but the rapid increase in savings is much more than that. Now, what it means is that if confidence returns and people start spending again, we could see good economic growth, and this would cause that virtuous circle of encouraging investment. Also, other good news is with inflation falling to below 2% for the first time in a long time, it means there's increasingly room to cut interest rates, and this could increase consumer spending and help encourage investment. Now, I learned pretty early on in my YouTube career that negative titles tend to do a lot better than ordinary titles. But this does create a sort of financial incentive for all types of media to concentrate on the negative story. Now, in the case of the UK, you don't need to do much spinning to find negative facts about the state of the economy. It is based on reality. But at the same time, it is still important to be aware that although things are genuinely bad, dismal prospects can sometimes be over-exaggerated. We hear about job closures, but not job openings. And in fact, if we look at UK unemployment, it is at an all-time low, even if often jobs are not particularly good quality. The COVID lockdown, combined with a rapid rise in oil and gas prices, really hit the UK economy hard. The UK economy is very reliant on gas for electricity, and it caused the UK to have the highest electricity prices in Europe. And this cost-push inflation really killed living standards and economic growth in the UK. It caused higher prices, lower output, and the impact really scarred consumers. So if we don't get any more external shocks like this, it will definitely help the economy in the future. Also, becoming less reliant on gas would help in the long term. Now, in recent years, the UK has had quite a few self-inflicted crises. The austerity of the early 2010s, leaving the European Union and single market in 2021, and the Truss mini budget. Now, Brexit was a big shock to UK trade with Europe, and all the uncertainty about what kind of deal the UK would get definitely held back investment. And although tariff barriers and lack of competition will remain, at least the uncertainty of Brexit is over. The Truss mini budget was relatively minor in terms of long-term damage, but it did highlight a frequent flip-flopping of government policy and tax that we've seen in the past 14 years, and this created a lot of uncertainty for business. So this has the potential to be different in the future. So these are the reasons for optimism, but how convincing are they? A lot of these points tend to rest on the assumption that because things were so bad in the past, there's this catch-up potential to get better in the future. But you might argue that's not very concrete, more wishful thinking. When an economy does get stuck in a downward spiral, sometimes it can bounce back, and the UK has that potential to some extent. But at other times, the negative spiral can start to feed in on itself. There's no law that economies need to keep growing. Although it's not quite similar, Venezuela lost 90% of its GDP over 20 years. Things can keep getting worse. Also, this optimistic scenario rests on the assumption we won't get any more external shocks, and we will get good, competent government. So the chances of both of those things happening, you might argue, are relatively small. Also, this optimistic scenario ignores many of the long-term issues around the economy, such as short-termism, lack of skilled labour, and also the demographic changes which are going to knock about 0.5% of economic growth. We've got falling birth rates, an ageing population. This video explains why the working age population is set to decline quite rapidly.